This is a draft of a book. It would be wrong to call it a first draft because many parts of it have been rewritten and edited. It's been tinkered with. The digital age has ushered in a new way of writing. Misspelled words are fixed with a click whenever the little red line appears beneath them. Beyond that, a sentence can be worked and reworked over and over until it hopefully makes sense. The backspace key replaces the crossed out line and hides all the evidence of the disruptive train of thought. The advent of computers and the internet have not only reduced the need for note-taking, handwriting, typed drafts, and costly edits, it has allowed the best and most beautiful of creative projects to rise to the surface and funnel themselves directly to the readers and viewers. The longer collective eyes linger on a project, the more widely it is pushed into the feeds of new viewers. But the signifiers best or good or even high quality are not really accurate descriptions of what rises to the top. It's something called salience, the characteristic that makes things noticeable, and sometimes that means things that are good, true, and beautiful. But more often it simply means they are bright and shiny, and sometimes it means they are loud, angry, toxic, and destructive. This phenomenon has changed not only our tastes, but our ambitions. Everything we see, touch, taste, and feel is optimized to delight our senses, but we have not become so optimized. When we compare ourselves and our efforts to what we see, touch, taste, and feel in the world around us, we often come up short. The onward march of progress has produced a world that our ancestors could only dream of. But the means of achieving those results have eliminated the need for a massive part of what once made the world go round, mainly human effort. As a woodworker, I discovered that there was less and less good reason to pursue what was traditionally considered the higher degrees of excellence. The items that graced the cover of fine woodworking magazines 20 and 30 years ago now look completely unremarkable, as similar items can be purchased for less than the cost of lumber at any big box store, or shipped flat and assembled in the comfort of your living room. Furniture was once made from trees, organic things that grow in the dirt, susceptible to infestations from fungi and insects. They are roundish structures with limbs shooting out at odd angles, rarely containing anything resembling perfect symmetry, straightness, or smoothness. They are full of water, shaped by the wind and sun, and can warp, twist, and crack as they dry. Over the millennia, people have perfected the techniques used to turn trees into flat boards, and further refine those boards into useful objects that are square, straight, flat, and smooth. But to our 21st century eyes, those features are not identified with human knowledge or ingenuity, but with the machines of mass production. There is no need to worry about the proper way to dry wood or how to plane it according to the grain direction. Trees can be ground up into sawdust, mixed with petroleum-based adhesives, and poured into perfectly flat, uniform slabs. They can be covered with a thin veneer of wood, or even have a wood grain pattern printed on their surface. I decided to buck the trend. Instead of spending countless hours bringing organic materials into conformity with industrial standards, I would leave the waney edges, worm tracks, and knotholes. I would plane the high spots, but I wouldn't chase uniformity of thickness, flatness, or straightness. What I discovered is not only could I produce furniture more quickly, but that people liked the rugged appearance. In a world full of smoothness, sometimes it pays to be a little rough. We are now living in a time when people are increasingly skeptical of the hyper-salient images they see on screens, yet they don't know what to do about it. In a perfect world of perfect people, being a bit rough around the edges might make you stand out, as fodder for the meme machine. It's hard to find things that are real, and that you can trust. Scratch deep enough beneath the surface of the veneer, and you find a chemical abomination, and it's not just the furniture. Artificiality is in everything from burritos to breasts to bureaucracy. The backlash has come in the form of an obsession with authenticity, a subjective term that can only be defined by the individual. Usually, it's a celebration of a person's worst behaviors and a complete refusal to change. A log can be authentic, but it can be awfully hard to balance a plate of nachos on its surface. It needs to undergo some transformation to reach its full potential. The authentic nature of the log may limit its potential in some ways. The stuff necessary to become a Maloof rocker does not exist in every tree, but there's a process that can improve its function. There is still value in hard work and effort, even if the result is different than what we had hoped for. The pieces of furniture that interest me most have two kinds of marks on them. Some marks tell the history of the tree, whether it's the prized ripples of fiddleback maple or the knots, worm tracks, and iron stains from maple taps that are often called defects. The marks caused by circumstance were always in the tree. The other marks are from the tools whose evidence has not been entirely erased. The rustic scoops from a scrub plane or the knife lines on a dovetailed drawer box tell a story of a second life. It is this secondary story that provided the impetus to write this book. The way things are now does not always determine the way things will be. There are reasons to have hope, and many of them are found in the people and places that have been abused and abandoned by the onward marching drive of progress. This writing is an outgrowth of an earlier project into the digital domain. I once had a dream of finding success in the growing content creation market, and specifically in the makerspace of woodworking. When the opportunity arose to switch from the retail sales floor to a full-time position fixing, repurposing, and crafting furniture, I honed my skills through the uploads of old episodes of the New Yankee Workshop on YouTube. In a friendly competition with a coworker, I sealed the deal by recreating Norm Abrams' classic trestle table out of old 2x12s. Through the more primitive version of the YouTube algorithm, circa 2014, I had come to enjoy the burgeoning community of channels in the DIY makerspace. I was envious of their position, not for the fame or the success, but for the freedom to pursue their creative ideas, unrestrained by the cost of materials and equipment. My greatest frustration was the pedestrian projects they chose to make. I now realize much of this was due to a phenomenon called audience capture, where they tried to capture the spirit of the algorithm to maximize profits. This usually leads to an Ouroboros circle of mediocrity eating its own tail, devouring the things that first made them popular. I had previously gone into a significant amount of debt investing in audio equipment to start a recording studio, but having realized that procuring business wasn't my strong suit, I was wary of making a similar mistake in pursuing online notoriety. I had gotten married in the intervening years, and the budget for failed dreams was quite slim. But in crafting the table that had gotten me my job, I had learned how to capitalize on rare opportunities by forgoing humility and going all in to exceed expectations. A similar scenario seemed to present itself not long after our first daughter was born. The Modern Maker podcast hosted a competition for viewers to craft anything they wanted out of two 2x4s and posted the results online. Though there was a winner, every entrant's piece of furniture was featured on their YouTube channel. When a second competition came around, they made the same promise. This time, the contest was to see what could be done with a single sheet of plywood. I set to work designing a project that I was sure people would be interested in. I didn't expect to win, but I figured that having the notoriety from being featured on a major platform would give me the boost I needed to reach the next opportunity, be it online or to start a business or some combination of the two. But this time, I had access to and become proficient at using a CNC router, an advantage not afforded to most hobbyists. I put it to good use. Considering the audience and their interests, I finally had the chance to create something that I had never seen before. The product I designed was a mobile tool chest that could be turned into either a 36-inch high workbench or a 30-inch high desk with a chair. I was extremely proud of what I had done. It wasn't perfect, since it was essentially a prototype, but it was functional, and I thought it showcased a potentially valuable concept. The visual flaws in the finishing weren't noticeable in the pictures. I submitted my entry to Instagram and was excited to hear what the podcasters would have to say about the design. When it was time to watch the contest wrap up, I watched in eager anticipation. I don't think I was too worried when they said that due to the high volume of entrants, they would not be able to keep their promise to show everyone's entry. Because in checking other entrants with the hashtag, I felt confident that my design and execution were noteworthy enough to make the cut. As the hour passed, I began to grow bitter, as my entry never made it onto the screen. The winner was a coffee table that they liked because it used the striped edges of the plywood to make a pattern. My best effort had failed to pierce the veil that separated the consumers from the creators. Two dreams died. Not only the dream of owning a business with enough notoriety that I wouldn't have to worry about constantly hunting down work to feed my family, but the more ethereal dream of being someone on the other side of the glass. Not to be famous, but to belong. Woodworking was the entry into that world, but what I envied was the camaraderie of like-minded friends. I thought that if someone valued what I created, perhaps they would value me as well. My failure to bridge that first gap seemed to answer the second question as well. The first draft of my creative career ended like a tree felled by a storm, alone and unnoticed. Yet, sometimes a tree felled can sprout anew. A few years later, I stumbled across something completely different from the online communities I had noticed in the past. A pastor making videos with rough edges, and a group of friends that seemed to bear up with one another, despite their tedious moping over the bad experiences they had received from closed-minded church people over minor theological hang-ups. Paul Vanderklay doesn't edit his videos. The older ones were low-res and the audio wasn't great. The PowerPoint graphics with the yellow text were designed to be readable, not aesthetically pleasing. The only other channel I could find that was connected to his little movement at first was called Randos United. It seemed to be dominated by a whiny guy named Luke, who was great at identifying problems and terrible at coming up with solutions. Those conversations were just recorded Zoom calls. It was the kind of thing that anyone could do. Unwanted material, marks left by tools, the little corner of the internet I stumbled into was providing something valuable that has been missing from our world. The pattern and evidence of a story still in progress. People who had been down on their luck and found a way to get back up. Many of them still had a long way to go. Others had found what they had long been searching for. As they talked to Pastor Paul, we got to see something rarely witnessed in the world, a peek behind the curtain. The randos provided something valuable, a blueprint for how to listen, how to hear, and how to share the stories of our lives. The group led with their wounds. They showed the imperfections caused by nature and the tool marks of their progress, however incremental it might be. Over the course of the last few years, I have found my way on the other side of the screen many times. I've talked with Pastor Paul and many other people that I call friends. I've talked with some of them on the phone and even met some in person. Luke still has more problems than solutions, but I'm glad to have been able to give him a hug and share a meal together. Just as the decision to embrace the more rustic aesthetics of wood into my furniture designs provided a path forward, the discovery of this community has shaped my understanding of how we rebuild human connections in the fragmentation of the digital age. Most online content is getting shorter and shorter. The strategy behind TikTok and Reels is to capture your attention with the promise of one short video. Paradoxically, it can lead to many hours of wasted time. In contrast, long, meandering conversations with people thinking in real time show us how thoughts and ideas are formed. Many of the ideas within this book had either their spark or their development during such conversations. The value of this messy, long-form medium is that it mimics the way the world works, or at least the way the world used to work, back when things made more sense. Knowing how people think and change their minds and make decisions can help us turn around and answer questions about how we arrived at this time and place in history. how this book works. My dear friend Luke is quite fond of the phrase coined by Canadian thinker Marshall McLuhan, "The medium is the message." And in that sense, the fact that this is a published draft of a book is quite intentional. Its peculiarities are intentional, and any unintentional mistakes made are intentionally left in. In that spirit, I want to disclose the criteria by which I am attempting to arrive at something approximating truth, accuracy, and authority. Number 1. Show the work. While there may very well be a more streamlined and edited version of this book at some point in the future, as long as self-publishing remains a cheap and easy way to share information, this draft version will remain available as an example of how ideas are shaped. Much of my thinking takes shape as I interact between the thoughts in my head and the words on the screen, and I intend to show the work as much as possible. Because I want to prove to myself that an argument makes sense, I tend to type out as much background information as I think is necessary to explain things to someone who is basically unfamiliar with the topic. This means you may find some sections that seem unnecessarily redundant if you are familiar with the topic at hand. However, I tend to be a generalist, and I enjoy exploring a wide range of topics. So if sections discussing the works of Lewis and Tolkien seem too simplistic for the advanced reader, hopefully you can appreciate the thorough explanations on sections about country music or professional wrestling. 2. Prioritizing embodied wisdom over expert knowledge. A quick summary to illustrate this methodology would be to say that there are some things that a builder knows more about than an engineer does, and the engineer knows more about than the architect does, and the architect knows more about than the city planner does, and the city planner knows more about than whoever is at the top of the bureaucracy. A new kind of paint that, in theory, has some useful or novel properties can be used in an experimental fashion. If it peels off or the colors fade, it's not too difficult to remedy. But no one wants to be the guinea pig who lives in a house built on a new theoretical foundation when our current designs have served for so long. It's only through decades of success that a new method can be proven reliable. Then, the potential trade-offs of cost, speed, or ease become relevant to the discussion. Our world is full of experts. Most people feel nervous about questioning these knowledgeable elites, but as the number of experts has increased, the overall quality of life has decreased. So I will not attempt to make appeals to experts on the basis of their credentials or the reputation they have among their peers. That being said, there are many knowledgeable sources to draw from, and I have shared them throughout. But it's because what they have to say makes sense, and it is useful for making sense of the world we inhabit, not because they are experts. Matthew Piaget has frustrated readers of his book, The Language of Creation, for foregoing notes of any kind. I have included footnotes throughout, not so much because I am trying to meet a standard, but because I like them, much more than endnotes, and it's helpful practice when the additional information would bog down the flow of the text. I also want people to look things up for themselves, rather than treating my words as expert advice. If there's anyone to be skeptical of, it's me. For this reason, I have tried not to take quotes out of context, but anyone who is reading this can feel free to check my work in this regard as well. 3. Story logic. The questions about how society came to such a state can't be answered definitively, as it's too complex to be digested in a single lifetime. But my experience as a carpenter has prepared me to make a decent attempt. There is an element of investigation when working on broken furniture and houses that forces you to learn the broader context in which your task is situated. It's the same for anyone else that works with their hands. And in the practice of surgery, dichotomies such as concrete versus abstract and technique versus reflection break down in practice. The surgeon's judgment is simultaneously technical and deliberative, and that mix is the source of its power. This could be said of any manual skill that has diagnostic, including motorcycle repair. You come up with an imagined train of causes for manifest symptoms and judge their likelihood before tearing anything down. This imagining relies on a stock mental library, not of natural kinds or structures like that of the surgeon, but rather the functional kinds of an internal combustion engine, their various interpretations by different manufacturers, and their proclivities for failure. That quote is from Shop Class's Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. You don't get to see the slow march of time as it happens, but you learn how to work backwards and come up with a story that makes sense. You could assume that a house is damaged because the owner decided to attack it, or it could have been weakened due to severe weather or the infestation of pests. One story is more likely than the other, but there's also the chance that something happened long before, as some pest found its way into the trunk of a tree and stayed there undisturbed through the process of milling and into the walls of a house. The future rot was determined by events far in the past. Sometimes fixing things doesn't rely on having the exact right story, but when the damage keeps coming back, you have to go back and dig a little further. There's been a trend around trying to tell a better story, but the people advocating for that are doing it wrong. They want to tell a better story about the future. But to do so requires more than telling a better story from here forward. It's about uncovering a story that makes sense of how we got here. That is the means through which I am seeking to find and tell the truth. Someone might quibble about details, but the task for you is to say, does this story make sense? Does the conclusion I have arrived at make sense of the details available? If you are aware of some pertinent information that radically changes the flow of information and ends up with a different conclusion, then you are more than welcome to correct me. But any factual errors or mistakes need to be filtered through the question, does this detail change the direction and outcome of the story being told? If not, then it doesn't really matter. This is the basic task performed by crime scene investigators and investigative journalists, as well as the aforementioned doctors and mechanics. Juries decide the fate of criminals based on the inference to the best explanation. The evidence is there, but it's up to the two sides to tell the better story. If both attorneys are competent, the true story should win, even if not every detail is correct. This leads to the next method being used. 4. Gist and Gestalt. These two terms describe a micro and a macro view of objects and events. To determine the gist of what someone is saying is to extract the essence of what they are trying to convey, overlooking any errors that might be derived from an over-literal interpretation of speech or writing, or to choose not to punish them from factual mistakes. When someone talks about how Moses loaded the animals into the ark and the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, to extract the gist is to realize that the error made was calling Noah Moses, and not to dismiss them because Moses was the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. When a father tells his son to pick up his toys off the floor, and he is upset because they are all in a pile on the bed, the gist was that the toys needed to go back where they belong, not that the floor must be cleared at all costs. In this way, the gist of this book is that I am attempting to share pertinent truths about the problems in our world and possible solutions. I am making an effort to be clear, but the person reading is responsible for heeding or ignoring the gist of the message. Gestalt refers to the big picture view of the situation. If an image in a newspaper is black and white, the evidence of a single speck of red does not negate the validity of saying that the picture is in black and white. The exceptions do not negate the generalities. As I try to paint a picture of the world through various avenues of study, the important thing is to grasp the big picture. Undoubtedly, some people are greater experts than I am in each of the various fields discussed. But myopic focus on a single field of study often leads to an inability to see the big picture. The value of a generalist is often found in their ability to step back and see the similarities across a broad range of topics. This interwoven pattern of principles comprises the gestalt, and if you can see the big picture, some level of expertise in one area should help you find the gist of where the problem lies in any other. This leads to the next point of how this book works. 5. Good is good enough. One of the great granddaddies of YouTube creatives, Jimmy DiResta, has a wise saying that he has shared far and wide. If it looks straight, it is straight. In other words, don't let your instruments tell lies to your eyes. Growing up in and around old homes, nothing was level, plumb, or straight. Over the course of a century, even the glass in the window panes will slowly sag under the pull of gravity, thickening at the bottom and thinning at the top. Note to the audiobook. I have already been corrected that this is incorrect and that it was due to part of the manufacturing, but it goes to show that the gist is more important than the details. Yet these old houses, despite their inability to maintain a perfect posture, remain solid, lasting far longer than many more recently built structures. There is a downside, though, because levels and rulers are useless for hanging pictures in old houses. A level picture frame is almost certain to appear skewed in relation to the ceiling, the floor, and any doorways and windows. There may be no parallel lines between any of those other planes and surfaces. To make a picture look straight, it's usually best to be parallel with the ceiling or the windows, but it may require an averaging of the error between all four sides. You could attempt to do this with math, but it's far easier to eyeball it. Once it looks good, the client can try to straighten it out themselves, and they will quickly return it to the place where it looks best. In this book, I am trying to point towards reasonable solutions for the problems we face. Our obsession with perfection and idealistic solutions often causes a lot more misery than the simple inconveniences we meant to address. In this way, the wisdom contained may have a short expiration date. Some great discovery could come from out of nowhere and render all these ideas antiquated and unnecessary. But in the meantime, temporary fixes and incomplete answers are better than no answers at all. Number 6. Walking by faith. This section was pulled from the first chapter and placed here instead. A small insight into the drafting process as the book takes shape. I had it right after the first mention of the Bible with a subtitle of Disclaimer. To be perfectly honest, at the heart of things, faith is the whole reason I am doing this project, and there's no point in trying to hide it. That being said, for anyone whose hackles are raised at the mention of the word Bible, my intention is to make no assumptions that the first-time reader believes anything particular about the Bible, besides the fact that it is a widely published and very old book. My personal beliefs about its truthfulness and correspondence to reality will undoubtedly color the observations I make from time to time. But for the sake of the reader, assume that the examples and conclusions drawn from the text could just as easily be made about a work of fiction, and from time to time I will try to use other works to make the same points. What I mean is that when you read Harry Potter, you don't put the book down when they first mention magic because you know magic isn't real. Because within the book, magic is real, and the story doesn't make sense when you take away all the magic. In the same way, when you read the Bible as a book, God is a central character, and he can do miracles. The use of stories to make sense of what we observe and experience in our lives is a skill that has been in decline. I believe that it is one of the most powerful ways to discover the truth and the trustworthiness of the ones telling a story. If a story doesn't make sense, there's usually a good reason why. The Bible contains many small stories, and sometimes they don't seem to make sense at first glance. Or two stories that do make sense don't seem to fit together. But when you zoom out and examine the story as a whole, the parts that stuck out as odd often fill in important details. There's an even bigger story about how we got the book in the first place, and how the details inside fit with our experience outside. That's where a lot of really interesting things takes place. Of course, there's always the possibility that I can make a mistake in my reading and observation, so if you are doubtful about anything I write about the Bible, please read it for yourself. You can see there's some redundancy about the whole story logic concept in there. This book is rough and messy. But since it's also likely to be long and unwieldy, I do hope to distill the most important elements into a simpler volume. If you would like to contribute to this effort, please email your comments to tectonicschool@gmail.com and include book edits in the subject.